The stagecoach driver did not even have the decency to look back as he cracked his whip and left her standing in the middle of Keeler, California, with nothing but a battered carpet bag and a photograph torn clean down the middle. Fiona Brennan clutched that ruined photograph in her trembling fingers, staring at the half-image of a woman who might have been her mother, the other half lost somewhere between St. Louis and this God-forsaken desert town at the edge of the Owens Valley. The August heat of 1882 beat down mercilessly on her dark hair, and dust swirled around her worn traveling dress as she stood alone on the main street, watching the stagecoach disappear into the shimmering horizon. Her aunt had promised her a home, a new beginning after her father's death, but when Fiona had finally arrived at the address in Sacramento, she found only an abandoned boarding house and neighbors who spoke in hushed tones about debts and a midnight escape to parts unknown. The ticket agent had taken the last of her money for passage to Keeler, insisting her aunt had relocated here. But now, as Fiona looked around at the ramshackle buildings and the harsh landscape, she realized she had been deceived by desperation and her own foolish hope. The town was nothing more than a collection of weathered structures clustered near the railroad terminus, a place where silver ore from the Cerro Gordo mines passed through on its way to bigger cities and bigger dreams. Fiona felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry in public even though there were few people around to witness her despair. She had 23 years of life behind her and apparently nothing ahead but uncertainty. The photograph crinkled as her grip tightened, and she forced herself to relax, smoothing the torn edge carefully. It was all she had left of a past that grew murkier with each passing year. No answers about why her mother had left when Fiona was barely 2 years old. No explanation for her father's reluctance to speak of those early days. Only this damaged image that showed half of a woman's face. Forever frozen in a moment Fiona could not remember. She needed water, needed shade, needed to think clearly about what came next. A saloon stood across the street, its door propped open to catch any hint of breeze, and beside it a general store with a faded sign promising dry goods and supplies. Fiona picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the store, her boots kicking up small clouds of alkaline dust that coated everything in this place. The valley stretched endlessly around the town, rimmed by distant mountains that looked purple in the haze, and she could see the glint of Owens Lake to the south, though even that body of water looked tired and diminished under the relentless sun. The interior of the store was blessedly cooler, and Fiona paused inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to mining equipment, and a long counter stretched across the back where a middle-aged woman stood sorting through a ledger. The woman looked up at Fiona's entrance, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Help you with something?" the woman asked, setting down her pencil. Fiona approached the counter, acutely aware of how desperate she must look, dusty and alone and clearly lost. "I am looking for information about a woman who might live here. My Aunt Margaret Brennan. I was told she had moved to Keeler, but I do not know where to find her." The woman's brow furrowed as she considered this. "Brennan. Cannot say I know anyone by that name, and I know most folks around here. Place is not that big. When did she supposedly arrive?" "I do not know," Fiona admitted, her heart sinking further. "I was told only that she was here." "Well, she is not," the woman said bluntly but not cruelly. "Might have been poor information, or might be she passed through and kept going. Folks do that sometimes, especially if they are running from something." Her gaze sharpened slightly, assessing. "You got a place to stay tonight?" Fiona shook her head. "I have very little money. I spent most of what I had on the stagecoach ticket." The woman sighed, a sound that carried both sympathy and the weariness of someone who had seen too many hard luck stories. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over, run by Mrs. Chen. She might let you work for your keep if you explain your situation. Otherwise, I do not know what to tell you. This is not a town with much charity to spare." "Thank you," Fiona said quietly. She hesitated, then pulled out the torn photograph. "Have you perhaps seen this woman? It is an old image, but she might still be recognizable." The storekeeper leaned forward, studying the half-image with narrowed eyes. After a long moment, she shook her head. "Cannot say I have, but that photograph looks to be 20 years old or more, judging by the style. People change a lot in that time. Could be she walked past me yesterday and I would not know it." Fiona carefully tucked the photograph back into her bag. "I understand. Thank you for your time." She left the store and stood again in the punishing heat, feeling more lost than ever. The boarding house seemed her only option, so she asked a passing miner for directions and made her way through the dusty streets to a modest 2-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged slightly, but curtains hung in the windows and the place had an air of being lived in and cared for despite its shabbiness. Mrs. Chen answered Fiona's knock, a tiny Chinese woman with sharp eyes and silver threading through her black hair. She listened to Fiona's stumbling explanation without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. When Fiona finished, Mrs. Chen crossed her arms and tilted her head thoughtfully. "I need someone to help with cooking and laundry," she said finally. "Hard work, and I will not tolerate laziness. You do your share, you get a room and 2 meals a day. You want wages on top of that, you will have to prove yourself first." "Agreed, agreed," Fiona said quickly, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, I promise I will work hard." "Come on then," Mrs. Chen said, stepping aside. "I will show you where you will sleep. We have dinner at 6. You can start helping then." The room was barely larger than a closet, with space for only a narrow bed and a small table, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains, and after weeks of uncertainty, it felt like a blessing. Fiona set down her carpet bag and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion that had been building for days. She pulled out the photograph again, staring at the partial face, wishing desperately that the woman could somehow speak to her, could tell her where to go and what to do. But the photograph remained silent, and Fiona was still alone. The days that followed settled into a demanding routine. Fiona woke before dawn to help Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast for the boarders, a rotating cast of miners and railroad workers who ate quickly and left for their shifts without much conversation. She scrubbed floors and washed linens, hauled water and beat rugs, her hands growing red and rough despite her attempts to care for them. Mrs. Chen was exacting but fair, and gradually Fiona learned the rhythm of the boarding house, the quirks of the ancient stove, the trick to getting the pump to work when it stuck. She had been in Keeler for 2 weeks when Quinn Malone arrived. Fiona was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the boarding house when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She paid little attention at first, focused on wrestling a heavy sheet onto the line, but then Mrs. Chen called out from the back door. "Fiona, come help bring in the saddlebags. We have a new boarder." Fiona wiped her damp hands on her apron and hurried around to the front of the house. A tall man was dismounting from a dusty roan horse, moving with the easy grace of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. He wore typical cowboy attire, dark trousers and a faded blue shirt, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. And when he turned toward Fiona, she saw a face that was weathered but not old, probably close to 30, with a strong jaw and eyes that were a startling light brown, almost amber in the bright afternoon light. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. His voice was deep and carried the slight drawl of someone from Texas or possibly Oklahoma. "Sir," Fiona replied, suddenly conscious of how disheveled she must look with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping from its pins. "Mrs. Chen asked me to help with your things." "That is kind of you." He untied the saddle bags and handed them to her, and Fiona was surprised by their weight. "I will see to my horse and then come in to settle up." Fiona carried the bags inside, setting them by the stairs as Mrs. Chen had instructed, and then returned to the laundry, though she found her thoughts drifting back to the cowboy with the amber eyes. There was something about him, a quietness that seemed to run deeper than mere silence, as though he carried his own burdens and had learned not to speak of them. That evening at dinner, Quinn Malone sat at the long table with the other boarders, but while the miners talked and joked among themselves, he ate in silence, his attention focused on his plate. Fiona served the meal, ladling stew into bowls and refilling coffee cups, and more than once she caught him glancing at her, though he always looked away quickly when their eyes met. After dinner, as she was clearing the dishes, he approached her in the kitchen. "That was a fine meal," he said. "Please give my compliments to Mrs. Chen." "I will," Fiona said, balancing a stack of plates, "though I helped prepare it as well, so I suppose I should say thank you." A slight smile touched his lips, the first break in his serious demeanor. "Then thank you. I have eaten a lot of trail food in recent weeks. A home-cooked meal is something to appreciate." "You have been traveling long?" Fiona asked, setting the plates beside the wash basin. "Long enough," he said vaguely. Then, as if realizing how that sounded, he added, "I worked on a ranch up north, near Sacramento. Contract ended and I decided to move on. Heard there might be work down here with the mining operations or possibly on one of the ranches in the valley." "I came from Sacramento as well," Fiona said, surprised by the coincidence. "Or near there, at least. I arrived 2 weeks ago." "Seems we both left at about the same time then," Quinn said. He hesitated, then asked, "Are you planning to stay in Keeler?" "I do not know yet," Fiona admitted. "I came looking for family, but it seems I was given false information. Now I am simply trying to figure out what comes next." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding or perhaps recognition of a kindred situation. "That is a hard place to be," he said quietly. "Not knowing what comes next." "Yes," Fiona agreed. "It is." They stood there for a moment in companionable silence, the kitchen warm from the stove and the evening light slanting through the window. Then Mrs. Chen bustled in with more dishes, and the moment broke. Quinn nodded politely and left, and Fiona turned back to her work. But something had changed. Some small connection had been made. Over the following days, that connection deepened in subtle ways. Quinn took his meals at the boarding house and often lingered afterward, sometimes helping Fiona carry in firewood or fix a stubborn door hinge that had been sticking. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, his comments were thoughtful and direct, with none of the empty flattery or crude joking that some of the other boarders employed. Fiona found herself looking forward to these small interactions. The way he would catch her eye across the dining room and offer that slight smile. The careful way he handed her things so their fingers would not accidentally touch, as though he was acutely aware of propriety and her reputation. One evening, nearly a month after Quinn's arrival, Fiona was sitting on the back steps of the boarding house, taking a rare moment of rest after the dinner cleanup. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air had finally cooled enough to be comfortable. She had the torn photograph in her hands, studying it as she did most evenings, searching for details she might have missed. "May I join you?" Quinn's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway. "Of course," Fiona said, shifting to make room on the step. He settled beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them, and for a while they simply sat in silence, watching the light fade. Then his gaze dropped to the photograph in her hands. "That looks old," he observed. "It is," Fiona said. "At least 20 years, possibly more. It is the only image I have of my mother." "She passed away?" Quinn asked gently. "I do not know," Fiona admitted. "She left when I was very young. My father never spoke of her, and he died 6 months ago without ever telling me what happened. I found this photograph among his things, but it was already torn. I do not know if he did it or if it was damaged some other way." Quinn leaned slightly closer, studying the partial image. "Have you tried to find her?" "I do not even know her full name," Fiona said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. "My father was not listed on my birth certificate properly, or the records were lost. I am not certain which. The woman I thought was my aunt now seems to have been a fiction, or perhaps she existed but wanted nothing to do with me. I feel like I am chasing shadows." "That is a lonely feeling," Quinn said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I understand something of it. My own family is scattered. My father died when I was young, and my mother remarried a man who did not want stepchildren around. My brother and I left as soon as we were old enough. I have not seen them in over a decade." Fiona looked at him, seeing in his expression an echo of her own loss. "Do you ever wish you could go back, try to mend things?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember why I left, and I think perhaps some things are better left in the past." He met her eyes. "Though I do not think that applies to your situation. You deserve to know where you came from, who your mother was. That is different from running away from bad circumstances." "I am beginning to think I will never find answers," Fiona said softly. "This photograph is a dead end. No one recognizes her, and I have no other information to work from." Quinn was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words were careful. "Have you considered that maybe the point is not just finding your mother, but finding yourself? Figuring out who you are regardless of where you came from?" Fiona turned the photograph over in her hands. "Perhaps," she said, "but it is hard to build a future when the past is such a mystery." "Then maybe you start small," Quinn suggested. "Figure out what you want from the next day, then the next week. Eventually it adds up to something larger." "And what do you want?" Fiona asked, curious. He smiled slightly, that rare expression that softened his weathered features. "Right now, I want to sit here and watch the sunset with someone who understands that silence does not have to be empty." Fiona felt warmth spread through her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "I would like that too," she said quietly. They sat together as the stars began to emerge, and for the first time since her arrival in Keeler, Fiona felt something other than despair. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there, a small spark of possibility. The next morning, Quinn asked Fiona if she would like to take a walk with him after dinner, and she agreed, her heart beating faster than the simple invitation warranted. Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look but said nothing, only waving her off once the evening chores were complete. They walked through the town as the heat of the day began to dissipate, past the saloon where piano music drifted into the street, past the assay office and the post office and the small church that held services twice a month when the circuit preacher came through. Quinn pointed out various landmarks, explaining what he had learned about the town in his weeks there, and Fiona found herself relaxing in his company, the conversation flowing more easily than it had with anyone in recent memory. They reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open desert, and Quinn paused, looking out at the vast expanse of valley. "I took a job today," he said. "Working on a ranch about 10 miles south of here. Owner needs help with the horses and the pay is decent." Fiona felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "So you will be leaving the boarding house?" "Not entirely," Quinn said quickly. "I will stay there on weekends when I can get away. The ranch is not so far that I cannot ride back when I have time off." He turned to face her. "I would like to continue seeing you if that is acceptable." Fiona's breath caught. "I would like that very much." "Good," Quinn said, and his smile this time was broader, reaching his eyes. "Because I find myself thinking about you more than is probably wise for a man who has known you only a few weeks." "I have been thinking about you as well," Fiona admitted, feeling heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert air. Quinn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and Fiona's fingers curled around his almost instinctively. They stood there hand in hand as the evening deepened around them, and Fiona felt something shift inside her, the tight knot of loneliness that had been her constant companion beginning to loosen. Over the weeks that followed, Quinn kept his word. He worked at the ranch during the week, but returned to the boarding house every Saturday, and he and Fiona spent whatever free time she had together. They took walks through the desert, Quinn teaching her to identify the sparse vegetation and telling her stories about his years working cattle drives and breaking horses. They sat on the back steps of the boarding house in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence. Quinn was patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Fiona was willing to give, but the attraction between them grew stronger with each passing day. Fiona found herself smiling more, laughing at Quinn's dry observations about the other ranch hands or his stories about stubborn horses. Mrs. Chen noticed the change and seemed pleased, occasionally giving Fiona a half-day off on Saturday so she could spend more time with Quinn. The other boarders noticed too, though most kept their comments benign, and Fiona was grateful for the general sense of approval that seemed to surround their courtship. It was late October, nearly 3 months after Quinn's arrival, when he showed up at the boarding house on a Thursday evening, unexpected and unscheduled. Fiona was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard his voice in the front hall, and she quickly wiped her hands on her apron before hurrying out to meet him. "Quinn, is everything all right?" she asked, alarmed by the unplanned visit. "Everything is fine," he assured her quickly. "Better than fine, actually. I have news." He glanced at Mrs. Chen, who had emerged from her private rooms. "Might I borrow Fiona for a few minutes?" Mrs. Chen waved a hand. "Go on. The bread can wait." They went out to the back steps, their usual spot, and Quinn took both of Fiona's hands in his. His amber eyes were bright with excitement. "The ranch owner, Mr. Henderson, has been impressed with my work. He offered me a permanent position today with a significant increase in wages, enough that I could support a family." Fiona's heart began to race. "Quinn, that is wonderful news." "There is more," he said. "There is a small house on the property, used to be for the foreman, but it has been empty for a year. Mr. Henderson said I could have it as part of my compensation." He paused, squeezing her hands gently. "Fiona, I know we have not known each other long by some measures, but I feel like I have known you much longer than 3 months. You have become the best part of my days, the reason I look forward to weekends, and the person I think about when I am riding fence lines or breaking a difficult horse. I am not a man of great wealth or prospects, but I am honest and I work hard, and I promise I would do everything in my power to make you happy." Fiona could barely breathe. "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" "I am asking you to marry me," Quinn said clearly. "I am asking you to take a chance on a cowboy who fell in love with you the first time you smiled at him over a bowl of stew." Tears sprang to Fiona's eyes, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will marry you." Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Fiona buried her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. He smelled of leather and horses and sun-baked earth, and it was the most wonderful scent in the world. "I do not have much to offer you," he murmured into her hair, "but what I have is yours." "You have already given me something precious," Fiona said, pulling back to look up at him. "You gave me a reason to smile again. You made me feel like maybe I was not completely lost." Quinn cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "You were never lost, Fiona. You were just finding your way to me." And then he kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Fiona felt the last of her fear and uncertainty melt away. Whatever mysteries remained about her past, she had found something real and solid in her present, and that was enough. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church, with Mrs. Chen and Mr. Henderson serving as witnesses and a handful of townspeople attending to wish them well. Fiona wore a simple dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar, and Quinn wore his best shirt and a new vest purchased especially for the occasion. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony, his voice booming through the small space as he spoke about love and commitment and the joining of two souls. When Quinn slipped a simple gold band onto Fiona's finger, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as though all the chaotic and painful months since her father's death had been leading to this moment. She spoke her vows clearly, promising to love and honor the man beside her, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, held in the boarding house dining room with food that Fiona and Mrs. Chen had prepared over the previous days. There was roasted chicken and potatoes, fresh bread and apple pie, and someone produced a bottle of decent whiskey that was passed around for toasts. Quinn kept Fiona close to his side throughout the evening, his hand resting at the small of her back or holding hers, as though he needed the constant contact to believe she was real. As the evening drew to a close, they said their goodbyes and rode together to the ranch, Fiona seated in front of Quinn on his horse, her carpetbag tied behind the saddle. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion, and Fiona leaned back against Quinn's chest, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had not experienced since childhood. The house Mr. Henderson had provided was small but well built, 2 rooms with a fireplace and a covered porch that faced east toward the mountains. Quinn had spent the past weeks cleaning and making basic repairs, and he had even managed to acquire a few pieces of furniture, a bed frame and mattress, a table and 2 chairs, a small dresser. It was not much, but it was theirs, and as Quinn carried Fiona over the threshold, she felt a surge of happiness so intense it was almost painful. "Welcome home, Mrs. Malone," Quinn said, setting her gently on her feet. "Mrs. Malone," Fiona repeated, testing the name. "I like the sound of that." Quinn lit a lamp, filling the room with warm, golden light, and then turned to her. "I want you to be happy here," he said seriously. "I know it is not what you might have dreamed of, but I will work to make it better. We will make it better together." Fiona crossed to him and placed her hands on his chest. "Quinn, stop worrying. I am happier right now than I have been in longer than I can remember. You are all I need." He searched her face as though looking for doubt, but finding none, he smiled and pulled her close. "I love you, Fiona." "I love you too," she whispered back. And then there were no more words, only the two of them learning the contours of this new life they had chosen together. The months that followed were among the happiest of Fiona's life. She settled into the rhythm of ranch life, learning to manage the household and discovering she had a talent for raising chickens and maintaining a kitchen garden despite the harsh climate. Quinn worked long hours but always came home to her in the evenings, and they would share dinner and talk about their respective days, building layers of shared experience and inside jokes and tender moments. The other ranch hands accepted Fiona's presence with good-natured teasing directed at Quinn, and the ranch owner's wife, Martha Henderson, proved to be a kind woman who was happy to have another female around. She invited Fiona to weekly gatherings with several other ranchers' wives, and gradually, Fiona built a network of friendships that made the isolation of ranch life less daunting. Winter came to the Owens Valley, bringing cold nights and occasional dustings of snow on the mountains, though the valley floor remained mostly dry. Fiona and Quinn spent long evenings by the fire, Quinn teaching Fiona to play simple card games and Fiona reading aloud from the few books they owned. On Christmas, they exchanged modest gifts, Fiona giving Quinn a shirt she had sewn and Quinn presenting her with a beautiful carved wooden box he had made himself. "For your treasures," he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "You can keep your photograph and anything else precious to you safe in here." Fiona carefully placed the torn photograph inside the box, along with a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet and the ribbon that had tied it together. "Thank you," she said. "It is perfect." As winter gave way to spring, Fiona began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Quinn, choosing a quiet evening in April when the desert was beginning to bloom with wildflowers. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and Fiona took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is something growing here," she said softly. "Something that is part you and part me." Quinn's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A baby." "A baby," Fiona confirmed, unable to stop the smile spreading across her face. Quinn let out a whoop of joy and stood, pulling Fiona up with him and spinning her around carefully. "We are going to have a baby. Fiona, this is incredible," she laughed at his enthusiasm, her heart full. "I am glad you are happy about it." "Happy does not begin to cover it," Quinn said, setting her down and then kneeling so his face was level with her stomach. "Hello in there," he said seriously. "This is your father. I just want you to know that you are already the most loved baby in the world, and I promise to do my best by you." Fiona ran her fingers through Quinn's hair, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment. "You are going to be an amazing father." "I hope so," Quinn said, standing and wrapping his arms around her. "I hope I can give this child all the things I did not have: stability, safety, a home where they are wanted." "We will give them all of that together," Fiona assured him. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the hot summer months. Martha Henderson proved to be a wealth of knowledge and support, having raised 4 children of her own, and she helped Fiona prepare for the baby's arrival. Quinn became even more protective, trying to take on extra chores to spare Fiona any heavy work, and though she sometimes found it frustrating, she was touched by his concern. In early November, as Fiona's time drew near, Quinn arranged to work closer to the house so he would be available when labor began. When the contractions started on a cool morning with clouds threatening rain, he rode immediately to fetch Martha Henderson, and then paced anxiously outside while the women attended to Fiona inside. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the afternoon and into the evening, but finally, as the first stars appeared in the sky, the sharp cry of a newborn filled the small house. Martha emerged with a tired smile to tell Quinn he had a son, and he rushed inside to find Fiona propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in soft flannel. "Come meet your son," Fiona said, her voice hoarse but happy. Quinn approached almost reverently, sinking down on the edge of the bed. Fiona shifted the blanket so he could see the baby's face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Tiny fingers curled and uncurled, and dark eyes blinked up at them, unfocused but already seeming to search. "He is beautiful," Quinn breathed. "You are amazing. I cannot believe you did this." "We did this," Fiona corrected. She looked down at their son. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names over the previous months but had never settled on anything definite. Now Quinn considered carefully. "What about James, after my brother? We may not speak anymore, but he was a good man, and I like the thought of honoring that." "James Malone," Fiona said, testing it. "I like it. What do you think, little one? Are you a James?" The baby made a small sound, something between a sigh and a coo, and they both laughed softly. "I think that is a yes," Quinn said. Martha stayed overnight to help, showing Fiona how to nurse the baby and checking to make sure both mother and child were healthy. Before she left the next morning, she squeezed Fiona's hand. "You did wonderfully. He is a strong boy and you are a natural mother. If you need anything, you send Quinn to fetch me, all right." "Thank you," Fiona said sincerely. "I could not have done this without you." "Nonsense," Martha said briskly, "but you are welcome all the same." The first months of James's life were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, but Fiona and Quinn navigated them together, taking turns walking the floor when the baby was fussy and supporting each other through the exhaustion. Quinn proved to be a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, talking to him constantly, even though James could not yet understand the words. As winter turned to spring and James grew stronger and more alert, Fiona sometimes found herself thinking about the torn photograph in its wooden box. She wondered what her own mother would think of this grandchild she would never meet, wondered if somewhere the other half of that photograph existed and what story it might tell. But those thoughts were no longer tinged with the desperate sadness they once carried. She had built a family of her own now, created something solid and real, and while the mysteries of her past remained unsolved, they no longer defined her. One evening in late March, when James was nearly 5 months old and beginning to laugh at Quinn's silly faces, Fiona mentioned these thoughts to her husband. They were sitting together on the porch, James drowsing in her arms after his evening feeding, and the air was soft with the promise of the coming warm season. "You still wish you could find her?" Quinn asked quietly. "Your mother?" "Sometimes," Fiona admitted, "but not the way I used to. Before, it felt like I could not move forward without knowing. Now I realize I have moved forward regardless. I have you and James, and that is more than I ever dreamed I would have when I stood in the middle of Keeler that first day, holding that torn photograph and feeling completely alone." Quinn reached over and took her free hand, lacing their fingers together. "You will never be alone again, I promise you that." "I know," Fiona said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "and that is everything." As the years passed, their life together continued to deepen and grow. James was joined by a daughter they named Sarah when he was 3 years old, and then another son, Peter, 2 years after that. The small house became cramped with the growing family, and Quinn worked with Mr. Henderson to expand it, adding 2 more rooms and a larger porch where the children could play safely. Fiona proved to be a loving and capable mother, though she sometimes marveled at how different her parenting was from what little she remembered of her own childhood. She was determined that her children would always know they were wanted and loved, that they would grow up with stability and security. Quinn was equally devoted, teaching James to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk and reading stories to Sarah and Peter every evening before bed. The ranch prospered, and Quinn's position became more secure. Mr. Henderson eventually made him foreman, recognizing his skill with horses and his natural leadership abilities. The increased income allowed them small luxuries: new clothes for the children without having to wait for hand-me-downs, occasional trips to larger towns for supplies and entertainment, savings put away for emergencies. On their 10th anniversary, Quinn surprised Fiona with a trip to Independence, the county seat, where they spent 2 days in a hotel while Martha Henderson watched the children. It was the first time they had been truly alone together since James's birth, and they reveled in the freedom, taking long walks and eating meals in restaurants, and talking late into the night about everything and nothing. On the second evening, as they were preparing to return home, Quinn presented Fiona with a small wrapped package. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Open it," Quinn urged. Fiona pressed the tiny catch, and the locket opened to reveal 2 miniature photographs, one of her and one of Quinn, taken by a photographer in Independence earlier that day. "Quinn, this is beautiful," she said, tears pricking her eyes. "I thought maybe you could wear this instead of carrying that torn photograph," Quinn said. "Not to replace it or forget about your mother, but to have something whole and complete to hold onto, something that represents the family we have built together." Fiona threw her arms around him, the locket pressed between them. "I love it. I love you. Thank you for understanding what I needed even before I did." Quinn fastened the locket around her neck, and Fiona wore it every day from that moment forward, the weight of it against her chest, a constant reminder of the love that had transformed her life. When James was 12 and beginning to show his father's talent with horses, something unexpected happened that brought Fiona's past back into focus. A letter arrived at the ranch, forwarded from Mrs. Chen's boarding house, where Fiona had listed it as her last known address. The envelope was worn from its journey, and the return address was from a law office in San Francisco. Fiona opened it with trembling hands, Quinn reading over her shoulder. The letter was brief and formal, stating that a woman named Fiona Brennan had passed away 3 months prior, and had left specific instructions that her belongings be inventoried, and any items of personal significance be traced to potential family members. A photograph matching the description of one held by Fiona Brennan Malone had been found among the deceased's possessions, and the law firm was attempting to locate her to see if she wished to claim any items from the estate. "Catherine Brennan," Fiona whispered. "Could that be her, my mother?" Quinn pulled her close. "There is only one way to find out. Do you want to contact them?" Fiona looked up at him. "Will you come with me if I do?" "Of course," Quinn said immediately. "We will make this journey together just like everything else." They arranged for the children to stay with the Hendersons for a week, and then Fiona and Quinn took the train to San Francisco. The city was overwhelming after years in the small towns and open spaces of the Owens Valley, loud and crowded and constantly in motion. They made their way to the law office listed in the letter, and Fiona presented herself to the clerk, her heart pounding so hard she could barely speak. The lawyer, a Mr. Grayson, was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. He showed them into his office and retrieved a file from a locked cabinet. "Mrs. Malone, I must ask you some questions to verify your identity before I can release any information." Fiona answered his queries as best she could, providing her birth date and her father's name and describing the torn photograph in detail. Mr. Grayson nodded along, occasionally making notes, and finally he sat back in his chair. I believe you are indeed who you claim to be, he said. Catherine Brennan left very specific instructions. She knew she was dying and wanted to ensure that certain items reached you if you could be found. She was aware that you might not wish to claim anything, given the circumstances of your separation, but she hoped you would at least hear her story. "There is a story?" Fiona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is," Mr. Grayson confirmed. He pulled out a sealed envelope. "She wrote this letter for you. I have not read it as per her instructions. The contents are for you alone. Additionally, there is a small box of personal items, including the other half of the photograph you described." Fiona's hands shook as she accepted the envelope and the wooden box that Mr. Grayson retrieved from his safe. Quinn placed a steadying hand on her back. "Would you like to read it here or somewhere more private?" "Private," Fiona managed. "I need to read this somewhere private." They returned to their modest hotel, and Fiona sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in her hands for a long time before she found the courage to open it. Quinn sat beside her, not pushing, simply offering his presence as support. Finally, Fiona broke the seal and unfolded the pages, her mother's handwriting spilling across the paper in elegant, slightly shaky script. "My dearest Fiona," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have been found and I have passed from this world. I can only pray that you will take the time to understand the choices I made, even if you cannot forgive them. I was very young when I met your father, barely 18, and I thought I was in love. We married quickly, too quickly, and you were born within the year. But I was not ready to be a mother. I was restless and frightened and overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for an infant when I barely knew how to care for myself. Your father tried his best, but we fought constantly, and I knew I was failing both of you. When you were 2 years old, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I left, believing that you would be better off without a mother who did not know how to love you properly. I thought your father could provide stability and find someone better suited to raising you. I tore our wedding photograph in half the night I departed, taking my portion and leaving his behind, a symbolic severing of the life we had tried to build. For years, I told myself I had made the right choice. I moved to San Francisco and rebuilt my life, found work as a seamstress, and eventually opened my own small shop. But I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wondering if you were happy and healthy and if you hated me for abandoning you. I made inquiries over the years, always from a distance, afraid to disrupt your life but unable to completely let go. I learned that your father never remarried, that he raised you alone, and guilt became my constant companion. When I heard of his passing last year, I nearly contacted you then, but I was already ill and knew my time was limited. I decided instead to prepare this letter and hope that it might somehow reach you after my death. I want you to know that leaving you was not because you were unloved or unwanted. It was because I was broken and did not know how to fix myself. I hope that in the years since, you have found happiness and love and all the things I was too young and foolish to provide. You deserved so much better than the mother I was capable of being. The items in this box are small tokens, photographs from your infancy that I could not bear to destroy, a lock of your baby hair that I kept all these years, and the other half of our torn photograph. I do not expect you to treasure these things, but I wanted you to have them, to know that even in my absence, you were never truly forgotten. I am sorry, my darling girl. Sorrier than these words can express. I hope your life has been full and beautiful despite my failures. You are the only truly good thing I ever created, and I hope you know that. With all my love, your mother." Catherine Fiona finished reading with tears streaming down her face, and Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried. The grief was complicated. tangled up with relief and anger and understanding all at once. Her mother had not abandoned her out of cruelty or indifference, but out of fear and inadequacy, and while that did not erase the pain of growing up without her, it provided a context that Fiona had desperately needed. "What do you want to do with this?" Quinn asked gently when her tears had subsided. "How do you want to honor it?" Fiona wiped her eyes and reached for the wooden box. Inside, as promised, were photographs of her as a baby, plump and smiling in Catherine's young arms. There was a tiny curl of dark hair tied with faded ribbon, and beneath everything, the other half of the torn photograph. Fiona carefully lined it up with the half she had carried for so long, and for the first time, she saw the complete image, her mother and father standing together, young and hopeful and unaware of how their story would end. "I want to take these home," Fiona said slowly. "I want our children to know they had a grandmother who loved them even though she never met them. I want to remember her not as the woman who left, but as the woman who carried guilt for decades and tried to make amends the only way she knew how." "That sounds right," Quinn agreed. Pain and healing all mixed together. They spent one more day in San Francisco, visiting Catherine's grave and leaving flowers, Fiona standing silently before the headstone as she said a private goodbye to the mother she had never truly known. Then they returned home to the Owens Valley, to their children and their ranch, and the life they had built from love and second chances. Fiona placed the completed photograph in her treasured wooden box alongside the locket Quinn had given her, and sometimes she would take it out and study both halves, marveling at how something so damaged could be made whole again. It became a metaphor for her own life, torn apart by loss and abandonment but slowly pieced back together through love and patience. The years continued to pass in the pleasant rhythm of ranch life. James grew into a fine young man, taking after his father in his love of horses and his quiet, steady nature. Sarah proved to be bright and curious, always asking questions and reading everything she could get her hands on. Peter was the most social of the children, making friends easily and bringing laughter into every room he entered. Fiona and Quinn watched their children grow with pride and occasional trepidation, navigating the challenges of parenting with the same teamwork that had defined their marriage from the beginning. They had disagreements occasionally, as all couples do, but they had learned to communicate and compromise, to never let the sun set on anger. On their 20th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration at the ranch. James, now 22 and working alongside his father as a ranch hand, had brought a young woman he was courting, and Sarah, 19 and teaching at the small school in Keeler, regaled them with stories of her students. Peter, at 17, was already taller than his father and talking about his plans to perhaps study veterinary medicine if they could afford to send him to school. As the evening drew to a close and the children dispersed to their various activities, Fiona and Quinn found themselves alone on the porch, the same spot where they had spent so many evenings over the years. The desert stretched out before them, beautiful in its harsh way, and the mountains glowed purple in the fading light. "You ever regret it?" Fiona asked suddenly. "Taking a chance on a desperate woman with nothing but a torn photograph and a lot of baggage?" Quinn turned to her with surprise. "Never, not once. You were the best decision I ever made. Even when money was tight and the children were crying and everything felt overwhelming. Especially then," Quinn said, "because we got through it together. Fiona, you are the strongest, most resilient person I have ever known. You took pain that could have destroyed you and you turned it into something beautiful. You built a family, created a home, and you did it with grace and love. How could I ever regret being part of that?" Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder, the locket cool against her skin beneath her blouse. I used to think I needed to understand my past before I could have a future. You showed me that was wrong. You gave me a reason to smile again when I thought smiling was impossible. You did the same for me, Quinn said. I was just drifting before I met you, moving from place to place without purpose. You gave me a home and a reason to stay. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss and the birth of their children and every important moment in between. The photograph in Fiona's wooden box was now complete, but it was just one piece of a much larger story, a story that was still being written with each passing day. James ended up marrying the young woman he had been courting, and they settled in a small house on the ranch that Quinn helped them build. Within 2 years, Fiona and Quinn became grandparents to a bright-eyed little girl named Catherine, after the grandmother who had never had the chance to know her descendants. Fiona held baby Catherine for the first time and felt a circle closing, the pain of the past finally, and fully transformed into something redemptive. Sarah eventually married as well, a lawyer from Independence who supported her desire to continue teaching, and they moved to a larger town where Sarah could pursue her passion for education. Peter did go off to study veterinary medicine, returning 4 years later to set up a practice in Keeler, serving the ranchers and farmers of the valley and making his parents immensely proud. As Fiona and Quinn grew older, their roles shifted from active participants to benevolent observers, watching their children and grandchildren build lives and families of their own. They slowed down, Quinn's joints aching from decades of ranch work and Fiona's hands becoming arthritic from years of cooking and sewing, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew richer and deeper, aged like fine wine. On a warm evening in late spring, when Quinn was 65 and Fiona 62, they sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. Quinn had retired from active ranch work the previous year, though he still helped out when needed, and they spent most of their time in quiet companionship, content simply to be together. "I have been thinking," Fiona said, breaking the peaceful silence, "about that first day in Keeler, standing in the dust with that torn photograph, feeling like my life was over. And now," Quinn prompted, "now I realize it was not ending, it was beginning. Everything that mattered started from that moment of absolute despair. If my aunt had been where she claimed, if I had found easy answers, I would never have been standing there when you arrived. I would never have found you." Quinn took her hand, his grip still strong despite his years. "Seems like fate had a plan all along." "Maybe," Fiona agreed. "Or maybe we made our own plan, built it one day at a time out of hope and hard work and love." "I like that better," Quinn decided. "Gives us credit for what we accomplished." Fiona laughed softly. "Always so practical." "One of us has to be," Quinn teased. Then his expression grew more serious. "Fiona, I want you to know that every single day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days, even the days when we struggled, I would not trade a single moment. You made my life mean something." "Quinn Malone, you are going to make me cry," Fiona said, but she was smiling even as tears gathered in her eyes. "Good tears, I hope." "The best tears," she confirmed. "Tears of gratitude and happiness and love so deep I sometimes cannot believe it is real." They watched the sun set together, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and when the stars emerged, they remained on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cooling air, neither wanting to break the perfection of the moment. Years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. the family tree growing and branching in ways that Fiona could never have imagined during those dark days after her father's death. The ranch changed hands when Mr. Henderson passed away and his son took over, but the new owner valued Quinn's knowledge and kept him on as a consultant, ensuring they could remain in the house that had been their home for so many decades. Fiona kept the wooden box with her treasures on a shelf in their bedroom, and sometimes she would open it and look at the completed photograph, remembering the woman who had been too young and broken to be the mother Fiona needed but who had loved her nonetheless. She told her grandchildren about Catherine, wanting them to understand that people were complicated and that mistakes did not define a whole life. On their 50th anniversary, the family organized a large celebration, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filling every corner of the house and spilling out into the yard. There was music and laughter and more food than anyone could eat, and in the evening, Quinn and Fiona were convinced to tell the story of how they met, a tale that had become family legend but never grew old in the telling. "I saw her standing in the yard hanging laundry," Quinn said, his voice still strong despite his 81 years. "And something about the way the sun caught her hair, the determination in the set of her shoulders despite being so obviously exhausted, just stopped me in my tracks. I knew right then, though I did not admit it to myself for weeks, that she was going to change my life. I thought he was just another cowboy," Fiona added with a smile, "dusty and quiet and probably not worth noticing. But then he helped me with the firewood without being asked, and he spoke to me like I was a person rather than just a servant. And slowly I started to realize he was different. Best day of my life was when she agreed to marry me," Quinn said, finding Fiona's hand and squeezing it gently. Everything good came from that moment. Their grandson Michael, James's oldest son, raised his glass. "To Grandma and Grandpa, who showed us all what real love looks like, 50 years and still holding hands." The assembled family echoed the toast, and Fiona felt overwhelmed by the abundance of it all, the sheer number of people who existed because she had chosen to accept Quinn's proposal, because they had built a life together on faith and determination. That night, after everyone had gone home or settled into makeshift beds throughout the house, Fiona and Quinn lay together in their familiar bed, exhausted but happy. 50 years, Fiona murmured. "It seems impossible that so much time has passed." "Fastest 50 years of my life," Quinn agreed. He turned his head to look at her in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "If I had it all to do over, I would not change a single thing. Not even the time Peter broke his arm and we spent 3 days terrified he would lose use of it. Not even that," Quinn confirmed. "Because he healed and we got through it, and it is part of our story." Fiona reached over and traced the lines of his face, memorizing features she knew as well as her own. "I love you, Quinn Malone. Thank you for giving me a life I never dreamed was possible." "I love you too, Fiona. Always have, always will." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, the way they had done for 50 years, and Fiona's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she had been wrong that day in Keeler. She had not been abandoned. She had been set on a path that would lead her to everything she truly needed. The years moved forward, bringing the inevitable changes that come with age. Quinn's health began to decline when he was 85, his heart struggling with the strain of a long life lived fully. Fiona cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her throughout their marriage, and their children took turns staying with them to help. On a cool autumn evening, with the windows open to let in the desert breeze and family gathered quietly in the next room, Quinn took Fiona's hand and smiled at her with the same warmth he had shown that first time over a bowl of stew 53 years earlier. "Thank you," he whispered. for saying yes, for building this life with me, for being my partner in all things. Thank you for finding me, Fiona whispered back, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for loving me so well. Quinn's eyes closed peacefully, his hand still holding hers, and he slipped away surrounded by love and family, having lived a life rich in all the ways that mattered. Fiona grieved deeply, as anyone would after losing their partner of 5 decades, but she also found comfort in the knowledge that what they had built together would endure. She lived 3 more years, spending her time surrounded by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who were Quinn's legacy as much as hers. She told stories about their life together, making sure the younger generations understood what real commitment looked like, how love was built daily through small acts of kindness and understanding. On her last morning, Fiona asked her daughter Sarah to bring her the wooden box. With shaking hands, she opened it and looked at the contents, the locket Quinn had given her, the completed photograph of her young parents, the pressed flowers from her wedding bouquet now faded to fragile brown. "These tell a story," she said to Sarah. "About loss and healing, about being torn apart and made whole. Make sure your children understand. Make sure they know that even when things seem darkest, love can still find a way." "I will, Mama," Sarah promised, tears streaming down her face. Fiona closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years lift from her shoulders. She was no longer the frightened young woman abandoned in a dusty town with only a torn photograph and crushed dreams. She was a woman who had been loved deeply and had loved fiercely in return, who had built something lasting from the ruins of her early life. She had found her reason to smile again, and that smile had echoed through generations. As consciousness faded, Fiona's last thought was of Quinn waiting for her, that slight smile on his weathered face and his amber eyes warm with welcome, ready to take her hand once more and continue their journey together into whatever came next. The family buried her beside Quinn on a hillside overlooking the ranch, the mountains purple in the distance, and the desert stretching out endlessly under the vast western sky. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of their lives together. They found each other when both were lost, and built a love that generations would remember. The wooden box became a family heirloom, passed down through Sarah to her daughter and then to hers, each generation adding their own small treasures while keeping the original items safe. The story of Fiona and Quinn became the foundation story of the family, told and retold, adapted and embellished, but never losing its essential truth about the power of love to transform and redeem. Years later, one of Fiona's great-great-grandchildren, a young woman studying history at university, wrote a paper about the pioneers who settled the Owens Valley. In her research, she came across records from the boarding house run by Mrs. Chen, and there in faded ink was an entry recording the arrival of Fiona Brennan in August 1882, and a few weeks later, Quinn Malone. The young historian smiled as she made note of the dates, imagining that first meeting, and how neither could have known they were about to change each other's lives forever. She included in her paper a photograph taken in the early 1930s, one of the last images of Fiona and Quinn together, both elderly but still clearly devoted, Quinn's arm around Fiona's shoulders and Fiona leaning into him with complete trust. The caption read, "Quinn and Fiona Malone, married 1882, photographed at their ranch home circa 1932. Their descendants still live in the Owens Valley, continuing the legacy of resilience and love they established." The paper earned high marks, but more importantly, it ensured that Fiona and Quinn's story was preserved not just in family memory but in historical record, a testament to how two people who started with nothing but hope and a willingness to try could build something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. In Keeler, though the town had long since faded from its modest prominence as a railroad terminus, there were still those who remembered the stories of the old families. The boarding house where Fiona and Quinn met had been torn down decades earlier, replaced by a small park, but the old-timers still pointed out where it had stood, still told tales of misses. Chen and her boarders and the young woman who arrived with nothing but a torn photograph and left with a love story for the ages. The ranch where they had lived and raised their family changed hands several times, but elements of their presence remained. A barn Quinn had built still stood, sturdy and well-crafted. The kitchen garden Fiona had tended was gone, but descendants of her original fruit trees still bore fruit each season. And on quiet evenings, when the wind came down from the mountains and stirred the desert dust, it was easy to imagine them there still, sitting on their porch and watching the sunset, hands clasped and hearts full, two souls who had found their home in each other. The torn photograph that had once represented everything Fiona had lost became a symbol of something found, proof that even broken things could be made whole, that endings could transform into beginnings, and that love, when given freely and nurtured carefully, could heal wounds that seemed permanent. It reminded generations that sometimes being abandoned was not the end of the story, but rather the difficult first chapter of something beautiful yet to be written.